The village of Saint-Romain lay half buried in fog, the kind that clung to the ruined stones like memory refusing to fade. It was late autumn of 1943, and every dawn sounded the same. Distant artillery groans, boots on the move, and the low rumble of occupation settling deeper into the marrow of the land. In a barn on the village's edge, Etienne Marchal, once a quiet electrician, now a reluctant resistance saboteur, sorted through salvaged junk with the desperation of a man trying to wring miracles from dust. He had a habit of working alone. Not because he lacked loyalty, but because others had long dismissed him as too cautious, too methodical, too obsessed with things most partisans believed irrelevant. The resistance fighters admired bold dynamiters with steady nerves, not wiry men who spoke to copper coils as if they were old friends. Etienne understood electricity the way poets understood silence. But war didn't care for poets. On that cold morning, Etienne held up a coil of fuse wire so heavily oxidized it looked like it had spent the past decade in a swamp. Flakes of rust drifted from it like reddish snow. "Scrap," muttered Benoit, the squad's munitions handler. "Throw it out. We need clean gear, not corroded junk." Etienne didn't argue. He never did. Instead, he gently tucked the wire into his satchel, ignoring the laughter behind him. Rust meant nothing to him, not in the way the others assumed. Rust was a sign of time, yes, but also a sign of memory within the metal. It changed conductivity, burn rate, and sometimes, in the right hands, it changed destiny. The Germans had tightened their grip on the region in recent weeks. Rumors circulated of an armored convoy transporting encrypted documents and a new mapping device crucial for upcoming Eastern Front operations. Capturing it was impossible. Destroying it was suicide. Unless, Etienne whispered to himself, staring at the reddish coil, one understands how patience behaves under fire. But no one was interested in patience. Explosives were meant to erupt decisively, not whisper on their way to detonation. Etienne's proposal to the group, a slow burn timed ambush using unpredictable but calculable fuse properties, was rejected with exasperation. They planned to strike the convoy with direct charges placed the night before, a blunt plan that depended entirely on luck. Yet something in Etienne refused to let go of the wire. That night, as he lay on the barn floor beneath a broken window riddled with frost crystals, he unraveled the corroded fuse between his fingertips. Beneath the rust hid potential, temperamental, misunderstood, dangerous potential. Everyone else had overlooked it. But Etienne was already imagining the ambush that only he could orchestrate, one the Germans would never see coming. Etienne spent the next 2 nights conducting experiments that would have looked like madness to anyone who stumbled upon them. In a cramped cellar beneath an abandoned cooper's workshop, he built a makeshift test range. Old tins layered with sand, thin slivers of explosive compound, and the precious rusted fuse wire stretched like sinew across improvised brace posts. Candles flickered in the damp air as he worked, casting wavering shadows that made it seem as though the ghosts of the village watched over his shoulder. From the street above came the occasional clatter of German patrol boots. They passed often, their voices muffled but sharp, like blades scraping stone. The slightest mistake would mean death not just for him, but for anyone suspected of helping him. The risk was suffocating, an invisible hand around his throat, but still he persisted. He recorded his results on scraps of old postage paper. Rust thickness, increases burn irregularity. Ignition delay, variable but predictable within a narrow range with proper conditioning. Temperature effect, cold threatens to extinguish weak sparks, insulate fuse. Ideal application, time detonation requiring long fuse length plus staggered segments. Etienne wasn't just building a bomb. He was designing an event. A moment of destruction sculpted with the elegance of a clockmaker. And every variable mattered. Every tick mattered. The convoy's route had recently been confirmed. A narrow road snaking between a limestone ravine and a frozen creek bed. Perfect for creating a kill zone, if the timing could be mastered. Standard fuses burned too quickly for Etienne's plan. Timers were bulky and scarce. But the rusted wire, temperamental as it was, offered a strange advantage, a naturally slowed combustion rate, something the resistance normally hated. Yet with the right calculations that slowness became precision. On the third evening Jean, one of the braver couriers, slipped into the cellar. "You haven't slept," she said, noticing the blue circles under his eyes. "I will once the numbers obey," Etienne murmured. "You know the others still don't trust this idea." "They don't need to trust the idea," he said quietly. "Only the result." She hesitated, then approached the workbench. "Benoit says the charges are ready for his plan." "Yes," Etienne replied, tightening a clamp. "But his plan will fail if the convoy arrives early. Mine accounts for error." Jean studied him for a long moment. "You're sure this rusted wire won't betray us?" Etienne's eyes softened. "It already has, by pretending to be useless. Which makes it perfect." When she left, he returned to his experiments. At last, sometime near dawn, he lit a final test fuse. It sputtered fiercely at first, then settled into a hesitant crawl, a burn rate so steady and resistant to wind that Etienne felt his pulse quicken. It was ready. And if his calculations held true, the Germans were walking into a masterpiece they'd never decipher. The night before the convoy's arrival, the world froze into a brittle silence. Snow fell in thin, crystalline sheets that hissed upon landing, forming a delicate crust over the ravine. Etienne moved through the landscape like a shadow stitched into the darkness, carrying 2 packs, one filled with explosives, the other with coils of his carefully prepared rusted fuse wire. He wasn't alone. Jean accompanied him, her breath visible in pale plumes. Farther up the path, 2 other partisans kept watch, though they still distrusted Etienne's plan enough to keep their distance. "Cold enough to kill the fuse," one of them muttered earlier. "Or cold enough to keep the Germans blind," Etienne had replied. He worked quickly but attentively, positioning the charges not near the road but beneath it. Years before the war, Etienne had helped install drainage tunnels beneath this stretch of road. Now those forgotten tunnels became arteries for his sabotage. Inside the narrow crawl space, he wedged dynamite into carved pockets of rock, packing insulation around the fuses. When he spooled out the rusted wire, its reddish surface seemed almost alive in the candle glow, like sinewy veins carrying purpose instead of blood. Etienne measured every centimeter 3 times. The burn had to last long enough for the convoy's midpoint, the fuel truck and encrypted cargo carrier, to reach the exact point of collapse. Too early and only the lead vehicles would fall. Too late, and the convoy might stop before entering the kill zone. He added staggered fuse sections linked like musical notes on a score. Short clean burn, rusted segment, insulated pause, ignition booster. A symphony of destruction composed in metal. Jean knelt beside him. "Why not just use their plan?" she asked softly. "Plant the explosives directly and detonate by sight?" "Because they won't see everything," Etienne whispered. "But the wire will." Above them, wind tore through the ravine like a warning. The moon shifted behind clouds and the world darkened further. Etienne's hands grew stiff with cold, but he worked until every connection, every knot, every alignment was perfect. When he finally crawled out of the tunnel, the sky was paling with the first hints of dawn. Jean watched him cover their tracks, brushing snow with a bundled branch. "You trust it completely?" she said. "No," Etienne answered, staring at the road. "But I trust the mathematics of its imperfection." The convoy would arrive within 12 hours. And the rusted fuse wire, ignored, mocked, dismissed, was now the spine of an operation that could alter the region's fate. The morning of the ambush arrived with metallic stillness. No birds. No distant gunfire. Only the sound of wind sliding across the ravine like a blade drawn in slow preparation. Etienne lay hidden behind a thicket of frost-coated brush, staring at the ignition point, a small shielded match assembly built into the roots of an overturned tree. Beside him, Jean breathed slowly, the only sign of life in a world that felt temporarily suspended. A low rumble trembled through the earth. "They're coming," Jean whispered. German motorcycles appeared first, engines snarling as they scanned the roadside. Following them came armored trucks, half-tracks, and finally, the heart of the convoy, the fuel transport and a heavily guarded cargo hauler marked with black-coated insignia. Etienne's pulse hammered. That vehicle carried something valuable enough to justify the tight formation and the dozen rifle barrels pointed outward. As the convoy descended into the ravine, Etienne struck the ignition. A brief flare. A hiss. Then silence. The fuse began its crawl beneath the snow, invisible to everyone but Etienne's mind. He pictured every centimeter, every burn calculation, every place where rust would slow the flame just enough to allow the Germans deeper into the choke point. But something unexpected happened. The convoy slowed. Etienne froze. A soldier climbed down from the lead vehicle, examining something on the roadside, perhaps a fallen branch or suspicious rut. The entire formation shivered to a near stop, dangerously out of sync with the fuse's progress. "No, no, keep moving," Etienne whispered, though no one could hear. The fuse, merciless in its obedience, continued burning below. Etienne felt panic rising, a raw, choking dread. He miscalculated. He had accounted for cold, for wind, for rust, but not for the whims of fear inside an enemy soldier's skull. Then Jean squeezed his arm sharply. "Look." A second motorcycle officer rode up and barked orders. The soldier hurried back into the vehicle. Engines revved. The convoy lurched forward again. Etienne exhaled shakily. Seconds later, the midpoint aligned with the underground explosives. Deep below, the fuse reached the first charge. The earth convulsed. A thunderous eruption split the road open. Stone and ice exploded upward, swallowing the fuel truck whole. Flames burst across the ravine in a violent, sweeping arc. Vehicles jackknifed it. German soldiers shouted in disarray, scrambling for cover as the second charge ignited, then the third. A firestorm roared like a living creature. Etienne watched, stunned, as the cargo hauler toppled sideways, skidding into the newly created crater. Papers and equipment scattered into the inferno. His rusted wire, dismissed, ridiculed, had timed the destruction with surgical precision. For the first time in the war, Etienne did not feel like a man who had been overlooked. He felt like the unseen hand that reshaped the world. The ravine smoldered long after the last explosion faded. Black smoke coiled toward the sky like a dark prayer, staining the air with the bitter scent of burning oil and shattered metal. Etienne and Jean remained hidden until the echoes of chaos settled into a grim, ashen quiet. Only then did they emerge to survey the devastation. The convoy was annihilated. The encrypted cargo, destroyed beyond recovery. German survivors, if any, had fled or been buried beneath debris. Etienne felt no triumph, only the weighted calm of inevitability. Victory in war was never a celebration. It was merely the temporary quiet between storms. Jean walked beside him, her boots crunching over fractured stone and spent shell casings. "You did this," she murmured. "They'll tell this story for years." "No," Etienne said quietly. "They'll tell a simpler version. Something brave, straightforward. Something with a clean fuse." He understood how legends tended to erode the truth. Rusted wires weren't romantic. Calculations and hesitation rarely made their way into heroic tales. No one celebrated a man who sat in the dark, scribbling burn rates on scraps of paper. But Jean shook her head. "They'll remember the man who saw what others didn't." As they hiked back toward Saint-Romain, the frozen landscape slowly softened under the pale light of afternoon. Resistance fighters intercepted them halfway, breathless with astonishment as news of the convoy's destruction spread like wildfire. Benoit approached last, the disbelief on his face shifting into something almost like respect. "What kind of fuse did you use?" he asked grudgingly. Etienne considered the answer. For a moment he imagined explaining it all, the rust, the physics, the strange beauty of imperfection. But then he simply said, "An overlooked one." In the weeks that followed, the ambush became a whispered legend across the region. Some claimed the explosion was timed by British intelligence. Others insisted it had been divine luck. A few spoke of a quiet electrician with a touch of sorcery in his hands, though no one could quite agree on his name. Etienne didn't mind. He continued working in the shadows, repairing radios, setting traps, planning the next silent blow against the occupation. War didn't end because of one explosion. But sometimes, a single act created a ripple strong enough to tilt the balance. The rusted fuse wire remained on his workbench, a charred relic of the battle. He kept it not as a trophy but as a reminder. Overlooked things could change the course of history, if someone cared enough to see their hidden purpose. And in a world torn apart by noise and conquest, Etienne Marchal became the quiet force the Germans feared most. The man whose forgotten wire had swallowed a convoy whole.